Netacea asked 440 enterprise organizations across various industries in the UK and US to consider the effect of bots on their marketing analytics. While click fraud enjoys a far higher profile, the financial impact of skewed analytics is actually greater. Advertising to bots costs an average of 4% of online revenue, but the average cost of analytics being skewed by bot traffic is slightly higher at 4.07%, with telcos, eCommerce, and travel reporting higher losses. 68% of all respondents suffered a negative financial impact due to bots, while almost a third said they lost 5% or more of their online revenue to bot activity. Over 50% of businesses said bots have impacted their analytics, creating poor quality data which resulted in a financial impact on their company in 2020. As a result of bot activity, over half of respondents have run special promotions based on incorrect data, ordered inaccurate stock based on exaggerated sales, burned through online marketing budget, and observed skewed analytics, with travel and entertainment industries being the worst affected. Over a quarter of all marketing decisions are based on analytics, and 42% of respondents said they evaluate their marketing or advertising strategy based on analytics every week. The most sophisticated bots disguise themselves as real customers, meaning businesses spend money to attract and retain customers that don't exist, and ignore those who do. To find out more about the threat of skewed analytics, read the full report at netacea.com.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the Bot Management Review, How are Bots Skewing Marketing Analytics, with Netacea alongside PPC Protect and Spike. So today we're going to be talking about how marketing analytics can be affected by fraudulent traffic, how ad spend can easily be wasted, competitive advantage lost, and bad decisions can be made off the back of skewed reporting thanks to bots. So just to talk about what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk a bit about a survey that we recently conducted here at Netacea about how bots are perceived to be affecting businesses. Going to have a bit of an introduction to how bots affect marketing in the wider picture. We'll have a bit about ad fraud, how much damage does that type of attack cause, go into some skewed marketing analytics, what's the impact on businesses there, and at the end we'll have a panel Q&A as well. So on the Livestorm platform, you can see on the right hand side there should be a questions panel, so feel free to add any questions to that throughout, and at the end we'll answer some questions. So today I am joined, my name is Alex McConnell, I'm a cybersecurity content specialist here at Netacea. I'm joined today, first of all, Matthew Grace McMinn, who's the head of threat research at Netacea. Thanks for joining me, Matthew. Do you want to give yourself an introduction?
Sure thing. Glad to be here. So I'm Matthew Grace McMinn, more commonly known as MGM because my name takes far too long to say otherwise. I'm the head of threat research here at Netacea. My job really is leading the team whose responsibility is to understand what the bots are doing. So, how do they do it? Who are they doing it to? Why are they doing it? When is it going to happen? Those sorts of questions, trying to answer those sorts of questions so that we can stay ahead of the attackers and understand them better than they understand themselves, as it were. I'm looking forward to talking with you and the others on today.
Yeah, and that brings me to our next guest panelist, Neil Andrew, the founder and CEO of PPC Protect, which is a platform for stopping ad fraud bots. But Neil, do you want to tell us a bit more about that and yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Neil. I'm founder here at PPC Protect. We're a SaaS platform, works with media advertisers to essentially eliminate fraudulent and invalid ad activity on networks. So we exclude those kind of bots that we're going to be discussing today and those fraudsters from being able to access ads and ensure that ad spend is being routed to the right place. For myself, I have about 10 years experience in PPC, started it when I was about 17, 18. I've been in SEO for a few years before that as well. So got a pretty good overview of the marketing sphere and how bots can skew those numbers and analytics.
Great, good to have you. And we also finally, last but not least, got Patrick Curran, who's the paid media manager over there at Spike. If you've been on any previous Netacea webinars, you might know Spike a little bit, a marketing agency. So Patrick, what do you do over there at Spike, and what sort of experience with across the marketing?
Yeah, sure. So Spike, founded in 2010 by Duncan Coleman, who's spoken on a couple of other webinars before. Mainly, we specialize definitely in digital advertising, but more specifically within kind of SEO, SEM, PPC, and within paid media, we include paid social within that as well. So those are kind of the services that we offer overall.
Brilliant. Well, thanks all for joining us. Without any further ado, let's get into it. So here at Netacea, obviously we're very focused on bots, but the question is, why should marketers care about bots, right? So good bots can be very useful for digital marketing, especially, the kind of things like chat bots. Of course, Googlebot is like an essential, really, if you're talking about SEO, search engine crawlers. But what we're going to talk about a bit more today is probably more the dark side of bots, the kind that can sort of burn through your budgets, mess with your revenue figures, and skew your campaign efficiency. So let's talk a bit about what we mean by bots here at Netacea, particularly. So we use this sort of standard sort of definition of it when we're talking in these kind of webinars, and we're mostly concerned with those malicious kind of bots. So we help businesses to identify threats posed by bots, which are typically business logic attacks carried out in an automated kind of way, usually specific targeting of websites, applications, APIs. For example, a common one would be flooding the login page of a website with lots and lots of requests in a second, with like a leaked password list, try and gain access and to an account for malicious purposes. But what we wanted to know was how much awareness is there across organizations of not just how many attacks we see, but what's their effect on businesses. So earlier this year, in fact, we did a survey of 440 enterprise businesses across the US and UK to ask what businesses thought about this. We found some really eye-opening outcomes, which were featured here, as you can see, in a few publications, tech and security mostly. And there's some headline figures there that are quite eye-opening. But there's some figures in there as well, which were specific to marketing and what they figured would be the effect on their marketing as well. So that leads us to a more recent report. We pulled out some of those figures, and specifically from a marketing perspective, how bots affecting marketing analytics. Because quite often people see this as a problem for security or IT departments, or even anti-fraud functions. But now we're seeing a bit more of awareness of how bots can affect marketing. So we're going to talk a bit about some of the results of that, and we're also going to bring in our other panelists to give their expertise, which sort of leads me on to talk about one of the more kind of obviously relevant bot attacks to the marketing departments, which is ad fraud. So that seems like a good place to start. So I'm going to pass over now and ask Neil from PPC Protect. So what is ad fraud? What are the different kinds of ad fraud that you're looking at? Can you give us a bit of a quick rundown of that?
Definitely can do, because I've got a slide prepared on it. It's almost like we prepared it earlier. So we generally break ad fraud down into two specific segments. We classify malicious ad fraud and non-malicious ad fraud. So malicious is where there is a deliberate action to either fill the pockets of the fraudster or defraud it and cost money to the advertiser. And non-malicious fraud is what we would categorize as more collateral damage. So things that cause losses to ad spend, but they're not necessarily intentional. So malicious, we might have things like publisher fraud, fake websites displaying fake inventory, lining the pockets of the fraudsters. We have app fraud, so you might be on a pay-per-install model with your ad network when you're advertising your apps, and fraudsters can essentially spoof these installs, fake them completely, make it look like your app's being installed when actually it's not. There's a really interesting case study around that with Uber. Basically, Uber turned off about 60% of their ad spend. It was about $100 million, and they actually saw zero change in bottom line revenue because all of those installs were completely fake. We have click fraud, which is an element that we specifically deal with, which is the intentional clicking on pay-per-click ads or paid social ads in order to cost money to the advertisers. And we have competitor fraud, which is something that, if you're familiar with the click fraud space, you might think is a huge issue because everyone kind of shouts about it to be. The reality is it's really not. A tiny amount of the fraud that we see is deliberate competitor fraud. Yes, it exists. It's not a non-issue, but it's nowhere near the scale that some people seem to think it is. At the local level, where you're talking your local plumbers, local locksmiths and stuff, it can get quite messy. We have one client at the moment who are actually working with the CPS on bringing a prosecution against a competitor who's committing this kind of activity. But generally speaking, in the large scale of things, it's not a massive problem. And if you're working at a large brand, it's something you can not really pay huge amounts of attention to. We then have non-malicious fraud, like I said, which is this unintentional cost of doing business almost. So that might be things like scrapers finding out the landing pages that ads are pointing to. To do that, they have to initiate a click. It's not targeted at you. No one's trying to cost you money specifically, but you're just caught up in the wider sort of damage, if you like. And we also have comparison bots that we see a lot on shopping channels, which I know that Netacea are going to talk at length about later, I would imagine, where we see shopping ads being interacted with to check stock levels, to check prices for comparison reasons. And again, it's just collateral damage. No one is setting out to deliberately cost you money, but actually a large portion of the budget does end up going to this malicious activity. So just a bit on why people are doing this kind of activity and what the actual reason or benefit to them is. The main one is the dollar value. Right? There is humongous money in ad fraud, which is why it's such a problem. You can see here it's about $67 billion globally. That's bigger than credit card fraud in the US. That's bigger than counterfeit goods. It's bigger than tax fraud. But it's a serious problem, and yet very few people actually realize the scale of what's happening here. The second point is competitive advantage. So if you can get to a point where, and this is more related to the smaller competitor segment, I said, if you can get to a point where your budgets are being effectively utilized and your competitors aren't, because they're going on malicious activity, then obviously you're in a better position to capture more of that traffic, get more revenue, and get more sales. So at the local level, that's something that we do sometimes see. It's extremely easy to commit ad fraud. Anyone with a working knowledge of Google and an internet connection can get started in 5 or 10 minutes. You can go to a dodgy underground hacking forum and pay someone to set all this up for you. Like, it's really not difficult or expensive, and it's actually impossible to prosecute. So a lot of people don't realize this, but there is no law against ad fraud. It's not a crime. Most people that are prosecuted for some form of ad fraud are generally prosecuted for things like wire fraud and the illegal movement of money and transfer of money. But the actual act of committing ad fraud and defrauding an advertiser isn't a crime. It should be. There's a lot of lobbying for it to become one. But as it stands, it's not a crime. And I know that MGM, you've seen a lot of activity recently around hobbyists, like I mentioned before, with getting onto these forums and sort of buying these bots. If you wanted to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So we track all sorts of different types of bot actors. So there is something of a sort of simplification in saying that all bots are behaving the same way. But if we're looking at sort of ad fraud and that sort of area, it is very similar to the pattern we're seeing in others over the last year, where everyone's gone, we're all being stuck at home over lockdown. Quite a few people suddenly found their incomes being cut. They were put on furlough. Maybe their company shut down. There's all sorts of similar sort of financial reasons as well. A lot of people found they had a lot of time on their hands and maybe they needed a bit of extra cash. So they started getting involved in various other sort of schemes on the internet. As we saw quite a lot of people getting involved in what we call scalper bots, which tend to hit the e-commerce industry specifically, the sort of acquisition and resale of low supply, high demand items. But we also saw them getting more and more involved in other bot areas as well, including ad fraud, where more and more of these people at home just thought, hey, I've got a bit of technical knowledge. This isn't, like you say, it's not hard to set up. I'm going to get involved, make a bit of extra money here while I've got the time on my hands, while I need the extra cash. And this has caused this sort of influx into the the sort of malicious bot ecosystem of skills and resources, which has increased the amount of profits people are making and created a more competitive marketplace within that ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. It's like I say, it's similar to what we've seen, and it really is off the scale, off the charts in terms of how profitable this can be for people. Like, although we're saying here on this side it's the most profitable criminal activity, remember that ad fraud specifically, although it should be a crime, isn't yet a crime. So if you can have very, very little risk of being caught for something, and you can get multi-1,000% returns on it, why wouldn't you invest your money there if you're a bit unscrupulous or loose morals or whatever, you don't want to put it in the bank and get 1%. You don't want to put it in the stock market and get 11%. You want to put it into an ad fraud ring and get 2,500, 4,000% on it. And what we actually find through the data that we see and the data that's now publicly available is that ad fraud is less risk and more profitable for organized criminal gangs than drug smuggling. So if you think about how drug smuggling is always kind of positioned as this huge big problem globally, and governments work together to fight it, ad fraud is making more money for these gangs and nothing is being done about it because there's no risk. So why wouldn't they do it? They don't have to involve other people in a supply chain. There's no physical product to supply and so on. It's all done online with a couple of $100 to get it set up, and away we go.
It's a great way to launder money as well for organized crime.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some studies that we've seen that, to be fair, aren't verifiable. They're based on more of a hunch, and sort of the data checks out, but no one's peer reviewed it. That actually suggests that nation states might be involved in this. I'm sure you can imagine the kinds of nation states that I'm referring to. But yeah, there is evidence to suggest that. There's no proof, but there is evidence of it. And that brings us on nicely to who's responsible for this. Like we say, organized crime groups are the biggest source of that. There was an ad fraud ring a couple of years ago called MethBot. It was delivering $2 to $5 million a day to its creators. So a massive amount of money. They were actually caught eventually. I believe they were Estonian, and they were indicted in the US on wire fraud charges, again, because ad fraud is not a crime. And they got sentenced I think it was about 2 weeks ago, and I believe they got between 7 and 10 years each. So they made a lot of money. Who knows where that money is now and how trackable it is, but they're certainly going to have to pay for it as well. And like I alluded to before, we also see scrapers engaging in this kind of activity at a non-malicious level. When it comes to ad fraud specifically, obviously scraping can be very malicious still. We have malicious publishers and app developers. At the very low level, like I said, we have competitors. It's not a big issue at the higher end. And we also find that over 99% of this activity is driven by bots. So when you see click fraud and ad fraud sort of in the news, or you read about it online, there might sometimes be this perception that there's farms of humans sitting there clicking on your ads constantly and defrauding you. It doesn't happen. You can't scale it. It just can't be done at the right scale with the number of humans in the world. So we find that almost everything in the ad fraud space is entirely bot driven, and that's why that bot mitigation is so important to actually combating that problem. I believe MGM, you did a study on this. I think you got some results from that if you wanted to share them.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you did, here's a slide I prepared earlier, inspired by Blue Peter. We have quite significant findings. And I should note that these findings are very much self-identified. So these are what people know is going wrong. Of course, the nature of any cybersecurity attack is if you can't detect an attack, you're never going to be able to sort of say how much money you've lost to it or what's happened to it. But this is based just on what people themselves know has happened to their organizations. And as Alex was saying earlier, we interviewed 440 companies across the US and UK of various sizes, ranging from about $250 million to over $7 billion in revenue. So quite a broad spectrum, but generally speaking, we found pretty compelling results that ad fraud is a significant problem across all industry verticals and across all business sizes. 75% of companies knew they'd lost revenue, and pretty much no one, I think there were one or two who claimed that they'd not been affected or amount of revenue their revenue had not been affected by ad fraud. The average company lost about 4% of online revenue. I think it was actually 4% more or less exactly. Though I would note as well, nearly a third of businesses, 30% of them, said they'd lost 5% or more. So for some businesses, it's actually quite impactful, and it seemed to get more impactful the larger the business was. Small other businesses, only about 4% of businesses said it was about 1% of their revenue they'd lost. So we're generally edging up towards many businesses being in that sort of 2 to 5% plus margin. It's quite a significant amount of money. Is it, like you were saying, Neil? There's huge sums of money being made by the attackers here, but that also means there's huge sums of money being lost by the poor victims. It's definitely not a small issue, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting as well that you have those self-reported results from businesses as to what they think the problem is and how much they're being impacted. And then we also have, again, like I've prepared earlier, we have this data that shows from our specific platform and our own data set of what the impact is with these businesses. And we found that 13% of accounts that we've audited, which is about 15,000 ad accounts over the past few years, only 13% of those are clean. So we define clean as less than 1% of activity was invalid or fraudulent. So anything over 1%, we've got 87% of accounts that are having that level of activity. And we find that that breaks down to about 11% of total search spend being invalid, about 36% of total display spend being invalid. Remember, there's a revenue incentive on the display side with fake publishers where they're lining their own pockets, whereas search is more kind of scrapers and bots. And then about 17% of CTV, so connected TV spend, is fraudulent or invalid. And what we also find on CTV is that that is the fastest growing segment by far. And the existing tools that are in place to mitigate this and the protections that these CTV networks have in place are almost non-existent. There is very, very little protection there, and that is why it's becoming rapidly such a big issue in that space. It's going to mirror what we see in search and display eventually, without a doubt.
Alex, you're on mute, I'm afraid.
Right, that's fine. So thanks very much for that, Neil. Lots of good information there about ad fraud. Obviously, it's a massive problem for the industry, costing business a lot of money, and not a simple issue either to deal with. But another implication is kind of, I'm going to bring you into this in a second, Patrick, and ask you a question. But with bot attacks, the effect on reporting and business intelligence as well. For example, Neil mentioned a few sort of the non-deliberate attacks per se, scraping, for example, where that might send some false information to your analytics. You think that there are humans on your website doing actions where really they're a bot. So that can definitely skew your analytics and make a difference to your reporting if you're expecting a certain behavior or you think something's behaving in a certain way, but actually that's bots. So, Patrick, can I bring you at this point and sort of ask you a bit more about the role of marketing analytics and how that might be affected by bots?
Yeah, of course. I think if we just start, I guess, with the main thing that most advertisers are going to be concerned about, which is their wasted spend or their wasted money in general, I guess, because the effects of this aren't really just the amount of money that you've spent on their click. It's also the amount of revenue that you've wasted as a result of those kind of low quality per clicks. It's hard to know. We've mentioned there's all sorts of different bots. It's hard to know what effect like each bot will have on each website. Different websites have different goals, and not all bots interact with all of the same websites. So within each account, it's very hard to know overall what impact it will have, but certainly it can affect any number in your marketing analytics platform. There's also like some secondary aspects that go along with that. So if the bot does actually convert on your website, but the order then gets refunded or cancelled, do you then have chargebacks that you've got to pay? That can actually affect your actual revenue number. So outside of the spend that you've wasted on those users, you've also not quite had the same revenue from that channel. And that would, both of those things would decrease like your overall ROAS or your overall target CPA as well, like what you actually get back from customers. That leads straight on to misattribution of spend on real users. So you think you're getting a certain amount of users to your website. That turns out to not be the case. That can have impact on your remarketing activity, your audience's activity. And then, of course, increased testing time is another issue that you'll often have. If it takes longer to gather data from real users, that's going to take a lot longer. I just wanted to touch very quickly then on like the actual audiences themselves. They're really useful for testing. So being at risk of one or two conversions against an audience, like your micro audiences or your unicorn audiences. So they're audiences where you really want to bid aggressively, or you really want to target those people because you know that they will perform really well on your website. Those are often low data. If one or two conversions skews like the order value or the number of conversions that you're looking at, that can lead to big fluctuations in like your KPI, whether that's CPA or ROAS based, and that can lead to poor decision making. If I just touch on, Neil, you just mentioned there 11% of wasted spend on the search network. If you took average account of say 100K media spend per month, first of all, you've wasted, let's use the average, 11%, so 11K wasted. That's an average, so you could have wasted anywhere from 1% to 25, 30%. It's hard to say. You won't know that until you actually see the effect, but even just the average and just the wasted spend, that's 11K on that. But that's not really the whole impact. So if you then had that 11K to spend and your average ROAS for your account was say 1,000%, not only have you misspent that 11K, you've actually missed out on your 11K times your 1,000% ROAS, which is 110K in additional revenue. That additional revenue would actually change your overall ROAS to over 1,100%, where before you thought it was only 1,000%. If you're comparing that to other channels, that can have an impact on how you then make budget decisions. That can have a huge impact too. Another way that a lot of marketers will look at kind of performance overall will also be around traffic metrics. Neil, you mentioned 36% on the display network, which is very, very high. So if you took, say, 1 million clicks from the display network and you take, again, that average 36% traffic from bots, you have lost 360,000 clicks from real users, or wasted whatever that amount is. And that's a huge amount to lose overall. You could essentially, you've got 640,000 real users actually going to your website, but you're actually recording that to be 1 million. Now, depending on how those bots interact when they're actually on your website, so do they leave? Are they going to look at other pages? Are they converting? They're going to have all sorts of skewed data then based on your traffic to different pages. So your time on site metrics that a lot of people look at, pages viewed, and then just number of real users as well. All of these things will be affected by having bots on your website. Yeah, so it's like lost revenue. We've talked about lost real leads. So if the bot is actually filling out forms, you're just wasting time, resource. You could be trying to contact those people. If they then fill out an email inquiry as well, you're looking at your email metrics. That's going to affect those, because obviously no bot is going to actually read your email and actually buy. And yeah, all of those things are going to massively impact your budget decisions. And we've also not really discussed the impact on like your impressions or reach metrics. For a lot of businesses that use like brand awareness or branding goals, this is a massive one, because you don't actually know how many times a bot has seen your ad versus clicked on it. That's one where you have like no insight into what the actual number of impressions is.
Yeah, Patrick, I just wanted to mention here at this point about some of our own metrics here. I just wanted to ask you a question based around this, actually. So one of our findings was that on average, 27% of marketers' decisions are estimated to be based on analytics. That's from what we asked when we asked this question. What proportion of your marketing decisions do you estimate are based on analytics? The average came in at 27%, which was actually went up to 30% for those higher turnover businesses over $7 billion, and was slightly lower for those lower earning, 350 million to 700 million annual turnover. Do you think this seems low to you? Are you sort of surprised by that figure?
Yeah, I think it seems really, really low. There's a few possible reasons for that. I think probably the main one is people not actually trusting the data that they're able to look at. So if you can't trust your data and you don't know that it's accurate, then it's almost like, what's the point of using that data? You make one decision one day and it might have an impact, and another decision and another 5 decisions and it has no impact based on the data. And then you make a completely different decision, and because you can't tell if it works or not, you're just kind of hoping that overall the things that you do actually impact the account, and you can actually improve performance. Yeah, I'm very surprised that number is so low, because it's very rare that we will look at something and not try and find data to back up the decision. It's really important in the decision making process for us.
Yeah, and I think that sort of leads into talking about sort of the impacts of these kind of effects that we've been talking about. You know, bots coming onto sites, you're using apps, and maybe calling APIs even, and what impact that can have on the business in general. So maybe this is something that both you, Patrick, and Neil can talk on, sort of the impacts of this kind of activity.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Neil.
Want me to go first? Okay. So, yeah, I guess touching on the impacts that we see, I think one of the biggest ones is exactly what Patrick alluded to there, with being able to trust that data. So I think one of the strongest things about digital acquisition channels is that we can track every single touch point and we can attribute spend to where it performs best. But we can only do that if we can actually trust the data that we're working with. And if we have a hunch that that data might not be right, then every decision we make could be wrong, right? So what we find is that data that is further downstream from the click, if that first click, that first interaction is a bot, is invalid, is fraudulent, every other interaction that you're then recording is also essentially useless. You can't build any good audiences off it. You can't build good data-driven decisions off it, because it's not real user data. And what that leads to is a massive problem we're seeing more and more of at the moment. It's only going to increase, where ad networks, Google and Facebook are particularly bad for this, are really pushing their smart offerings, so their machine learning driven offerings. Now, machine learning is fantastic if you can use it right, but it's all dependent upon the quality of the data that you feed into it. So if you feed rubbish into it, you're going to get rubbish out of it. So you have platforms like Google with smart campaigns, or Performance Max is a new one that's come out now, that make heavy use of these machine learning models that are now basing off bad data. So they're getting conversions that aren't actually conversions. Maybe they're bots filling out forms, like Patrick alluded to, and that is now being counted as genuine user interaction. And so you're building your audiences and you're targeting more of this activity, and the amount of bot activity in the funnel only increases. And it's not what you want, right? You're building off bad signals, and you then start attributing your spend to the wrong channels, or you say that one channel is performing better than it actually is, because if we take Facebook as an example, it loves to over-report on conversions and make you think that it's doing a better job than it is, and that data that you then see is completely wrong. So when you have an extra 100,000 that you want to invest in marketing this month or this quarter, where do you put it? Facebook looks high, but is it bot interaction? Should it be on Google? Should it be on Snapchat or Pinterest or any other acquisition channel? And then, like Patrick alluded to, that's going to lead to a lower ROAS and increased testing time. And I think one thing that's interesting, Patrick, you talked about before, was these unicorn audiences that you have, and how you can kind of bid aggressively on these. But if the data is wrong, obviously it's completely useless. I'd be interested to hear a bit about how you test with those audiences and how bad data might actually impact it. What would be the actual issue of having bad data in a unicorn audience?
Yeah, I guess the biggest one with like a unicorn audience is obviously applying bid adjustments based on that audience, assuming if you're using smart bidding, you can still apply bid adjustments within a campaign. A little bit different for smart shopping. You don't really have control or any visibility into the actual audience's performance in those. But with like smart bidding, yeah, you would typically look for good performing audiences to push. But if you increase your bid on that, sometimes like unicorn audiences could have bid adjustments of like up to 500%, depending on the campaign, because it's all based on performance data. So if that is a bot that is just putting through cancelled orders, you're spending a lot more money on that bot, 5 times more per click versus your real users. And that's an even bigger impact. We kind of didn't discuss before about the impact of like everything being layered. So that audience that bot might sit within several audiences that perform well because it's just putting through fake transactions. Google Ads is recording the transaction data, or GA is recording the transaction data, but then it doesn't know that the order has been refunded. So it's still in the revenue figures, and you're over reporting on your revenue, but you're overspending on bots as well. So both of those things combined, actually, like we just saw in the example before, your ROAS increases straight away as a result of spending that money on real users. It's a big thing for marketers to be aware of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, heard quite a lot there about the impacts about those malicious and non-malicious kind of bots on both paid and organic channels all across the spectrum, really. But I suppose to expand a bit on why these bots are visiting sites, in what sort of volumes and what they're actually trying to achieve, what's their primary objective here, and how is it they're slipping by and able to have this kind of impact. MGM, I mean, you're our resident bot expert, threat research expert here. What's sort of some of the behaviors that bots are having on websites and that are being misconstrued by analytics platforms or clicks on paid channels? What are they actually doing, and how sophisticated are they?
So that's a rather interesting one. I'll probably answer it first of all by going over what exactly bots are trying to do, because it's very easy when we're talking about bots like this to think of them as almost like almost as a Skynet from the Terminator series, running around these robots running around the internet under their own volition. They're really not. They're being used by individual people, or sometimes groups of people, sometimes very large groups of people, for explicit purposes. And often these groups have different purposes depending upon what your industry vertical is, where exactly you're working, what you offer people, and what they can do to try and make money or profit in the manner that they wish to profit. So, we've got you sort of traditional attacks, the very famous ones, things like credential stuffing and so forth, where you see loads of requests going to login pages and so forth. You may see a lot of fake account creation, for instance, particularly if you have a lot of sort of special offers, say like 2 weeks free service, a 10% discount code for first orders. Those sorts of things can often encourage attackers to create loads and loads of fake accounts that they can then use to place orders at always have a discount available. You may also see a lot of bots who do carding attacks. That is where you have a bot will make loads of very small purchases under loads of different accounts. So this is often accompanied by fake account creation or credential stuffing. So they'll take over a load of accounts, or they'll create a load of fake accounts, give them all a stolen credit card number, and try to make a number of small purchases on those to try and understand. Let's say, as an attacker, I have a list of 100,000 stolen credit cards. I may try to make a purchase on each of those in order to see which ones will actually go through, and thus refine that list of 100,000 down to maybe 1,000 or 10,000 that I can actually use for criminal purposes, identity fraud, etc. So I'll refine that list. So I'll make loads of small purchases. You'll also see bots that are performing scraping, and often this is part of a larger, like the first stage in a broader attack. So, for instance, we understand scraping as focusing on 2 different types of focusing at a high level. Anyway, you've got your single target scraping and your sort of broader loose target scraping. Your loose target scraping is like they'll try and see your entire catalog, and we see bot groups that constantly report out on e-commerce platforms and streaming platforms entire catalog, advertising what is currently available on there. But you also get single targets, particularly for high demand, low supply products. You may see a single bot scraping, generating as much traffic as 8,000 other actual humans on a single web page, trying to find the exact moment at which that high demand product becomes available or comes back into stock. And then you get your scalper bots, which usually feed in from this information, your scalper and your spinner bots, and then try to make purchases. You may have scalper bots that purchase things and then resell them elsewhere. And you have your spinner bots, which essentially place an item into a cart to reserve it, but don't actually complete the purchase until the resale is complete, which is even worse for the organization that's a victim of this. Now, so those are the different types of attacks. And you can imagine that these are all going to impact you've probably got some ideas listening to this of how these may impact your own analytics on your own site. But it's not as simple as just sticking in a WAF and trying to block these bots. They're not simple things, and attackers are wise to this. And they've developed all sorts of methods to try and sort of hide them as human activity. And I've got a wonderful graph here where you can see you've got your purple line there. Those are what we call our mitigated requests. These were bots we blocked in this attack. And you can see over the course of a few days here, about a week, you can see the purple line matches that red line being actual human traffic. And the purple line seems to match it. They're actually emulating human behavior, both in terms of how humans move around the website, and some of the more advanced bots will actually almost use, well, they do actually use machine learning techniques. They'll monitor how humans actually navigate a website and then feed that into the bot, and it'll start moving around the website, moving the mouse and so forth in the same sort of way, all the way through to actually doing it at the same times in which humans are active on the website naturally, because of when we choose to sleep, usually after sunset. And that just gives you this sort of phenomenal idea of how advanced these attackers are getting. I mean, Patrick, do you find that, what did you find is the danger bots pose from a marketing perspective when you consider the problem of distinguishing between human and bots when they're this advanced?
Yeah, very, very open-ended question, that one. It can affect everything on your website. You just mentioned there, I've just written down that actually about the spinner bots, that they add to cart, or they can start the checkout process. Those again are audiences in pretty much any e-commerce website where you're applying big bid adjustments on those users. You do not want to be paying 4 or 5 times your regular CPCs on bot traffic, which is just going to continue to repeat that process. Poor decision making for sure will result from that as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, that poor decision making is recognized by the companies themselves. So one of the things that we did find is that nearly 70%, about 68% of businesses knew already that bots had skewed their analytics. And we were saying earlier, Alex, with that sort of only 27% of businesses were actually making decisions based on their data. I suspect a large part of that is they've come to not rely on their data. Yeah, that's a very similar number to the other 30% that isn't in there. And we've got skewed analytics costing as much as 4.07% on average, though certain industries are actually reporting much higher, with telcos, e-commerce and travel particularly being hit very hard by this. But if you look at the sorts of things that skewed analytics have done to people, that, again, this is people who've self-identified as, we realized there was an attack, and then we've realized that decisions we've made from this have been perhaps mistaken. 55% of our respondents noted that they'd ordered new stock on the back of skewed analytics. Same number again, wasted investment and burned through a marketing budget. 54%, pretty much the same number again, ran special promotions based on incorrect data. And when you can't trust your data, you can't really make good decisions. And, as you're saying, Patrick, you want to be able to make all your decisions based on actual information rather than your gut instinct almost.
Yeah. And even if you have the best data analytics expert in the world, if they're making their decisions and their analysis based on bad data, it's bad advice. Basically, it's as simple as that. You're not just wasting money on that person's salary to actually spend that time to go and look at it. Once they've actually gone and spent that time, the decision-making process, like there, as you can see, like more than half of users are making obviously bad decision choices based on the bad data that they have.
Yeah, one other point that I recall from the survey, MGM, you might be able to speak more on this, is just how long it takes for businesses to realize they're being attacked by a bot. It was something like an average of 3 weeks or something, as I recall.
It was actually significantly higher. It was more like 14.
It took about 3 months. Yeah,
3 months. Yeah, it's quite scary. Obviously, you tend to think of bot attacks as being very noisy and very, very obvious, but organizations generally only really feel the pain from them when they realize they've made bad decisions quite a way down the line based on the impacts that they've had. So it is on average 14 weeks to discover a bot attack.
Well, that gives us quite a lot of food for thought there, and it seems like the more you think about it, the more wide-reaching impacts bots actually are having on decision making and marketing, those sorts of things. So at this point, we're coming into the Q&A section. So let's have a look at some of the questions. Oh, just checking out some of the questions here. Okay, so everyone good? Right. Unfortunately, Neil's had to drop off at this point, but if you've got any questions pertinent to Neil, then please still put them in, and we'll get the answers out to the webinar. Here, there's a question about what can we do to gain control over these bots, make sure that our marketing analytics are realistic and that we're not wasting budget, marketing to illegitimate visitors. Do you want to speak to that, MGM?
So it is a bit of a tricky one, really. Dealing with these bots, they are sort of that insidious threat that you're trying to deal with. They're quite well hidden. I think the first thing I would always recommend people do is to try and understand the threat. Once you understand what exactly is happening, so I recommend, I mentioned some of the bot types here earlier with one of the earlier slides, and I think this is available on demand, the recording for this. So if you do want to go back, do feel free to do so. There's also the Blade Framework, bladeframework.org, which is a community-run framework. The idea being it's essentially a way of understanding bot attacks. It sets out the tactics, the techniques, the processes used by attackers. The website is still under design work. It is still being sort of padded out, but if you keep looking at it over the coming weeks, you'll get some ideas of how these bot attacks work as well. And I think if you combine that with your sort of knowledge of what is my website, what is my industry vertical, what am I looking at, you'll understand, okay, here is what we're looking at in terms of types of attacks that we're dealing with. If I'm in the e-commerce sector, I'm probably going to have to worry about things like credential stuffing bots, account takeover bots, carding bots. Now, what impact are they likely to have on my analytics? And how can I go about understanding what techniques they're going to use at each stage of their attack? And how can I detect and mitigate against those techniques? Once you start looking into the problem in those terms, you can really start trying to sort of unwind the thread of what's going on and undoing the damage, as it were. Though I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Patrick.
No, not really. I think it's quite a technical solution. I think there are some things that you can do within like your marketing platform, if it's Google Ads or if it's GA that you're using for analytics, with like basic rules to help you out. So like a user not visiting a website for, not taking the action that you want over like a 7, 14, 28 day period, whatever your cycle is. If something is visiting multiple times per day, that's like a clear and obvious one, but there are so many other bots that are way smarter and becoming smarter and smarter as well, and that's not really going to cut it anymore as ad fraud becomes more well known, and it's not a crime. It's just going to increase, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, I think I'd probably add as well to look the gift horse in the mouth. So one of the things we tend to see with these bots is that the people who are victims of them are quite keen to say, oh no, this is a great success, things are going great, we're getting lots of, from an ad fraud perspective, we're getting lots of click-throughs through this ad. From the skewed analytics view, we're getting loads of interest into this product. Look at it a bit more deeply and consider, is this likely to be, maybe half a dozen scalpers who are repeatedly making 8,000 requests a second to the same page? Or is it actually, 8,000 people all making requests? It's very easy. I mean, one example I could possibly point to is I've spoken to one organization who sold, to paraphrase slightly, essentially 2,000 video game consoles very, very quickly in 2 minutes. They're only allowing 500 customers onto their site at a time, and the average customer journey is 4 minutes. So you're then wondering, well, those numbers don't quite add up. They may be celebrating a great success if we sold out all our consoles, 2,000 of them in a couple of minutes, but the numbers don't really work out there. Let's take another look at this data. And again, if you're making bad decisions off the back of marketing analytics, off the back of your analytics, you make bad decisions. Don't just look at, maybe the data-driven decisions are bad. Consider maybe the data we have is bad, and if so, why? Let's have a look into that. Let's validate our data.
Yeah, I think another question here that leads on from that about sort of trusting the data. Patrick, you mentioned before about the data analyst kind of role in this, and rubbish in, rubbish out, that kind of thing. So the question is, how do we know the bot detection tool is accurate if we aren't trusting data to begin with? So I suppose if we're saying, we can't trust that our web audiences are accurate, how do we get to that point of knowing that it's accurate, that we can trust
that? I'll just touch briefly on that one first, MGM, then. I guess the main bit, so if you're using a web analytics platform like GA, you can compare your views and see what traffic has been filtered out. If it's like a paid media specific solution, obviously only the paid media aspect of that will change within the platform, but then you'll also be able to look within, if it's Google Ads, look within that and see, is your spend coming down? And what changes are you seeing as a result? Because you would expect to see changes. Certainly, it's not always going to be that obvious whether you'll see like a spend decrease or a traffic decrease, because it could be that your campaigns are limited to a degree by budget, and it's hard to actually say what impact that would actually have.
Yeah, I think really that's where I'd put the focus as well. Look at the outputs. We were talking earlier about making bad decisions off bad data. Essentially, garbage in, garbage out. That old saying. So if you implement some sort of way of dealing with these, some sort of, if you think, okay, we're now doing it. Now try basing a decision on the data. Have a look at the data, make a decision on it, and see if the quality of decision making is improving. Have a look at the outputs. Is the quality of them, is the effectiveness of them improving? And if you're reluctant to do it on sort of a live data or in real time, as it were, you could potentially even, with some of these tools, take historical data and then run it through a sort of solution, essentially, review the historical data and the outputs. And is that more in line with what useful information would have been for you at that time? You can then reflect that into the modern day, as it were. So, you can always use your historical data and then consider whether or not to test it on live data as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. The next question is sort of about the social channels. Obviously, we're talking about traffic coming to your website and Google Analytics and stuff like that. This might be something you can talk on, Patrick. How many bots are estimated to be on social media channels, and how does that affect paid and organic social campaigns?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So from Facebook's own Clarity documents, this is actually information that Neil shared with me a few days ago, but 5 to 7 billion users are removed from Facebook every year. That is essentially the population of the Earth gets removed from Facebook every year. Now, considering not all of the population of Earth are on Facebook, that gives you an idea of the impact that's having on social as well. It's not really that obvious how much that's costing you, but certainly that's affecting impression and reach metrics on Facebook, and it's going to be affecting everything that comes as a result of those two metrics as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think we've heard a lot in the media as well about bots on social media for various different purposes. They're posting different things for different agendas, and it just makes sense that they'd be clicking on adverts. Why wouldn't they be? So yeah, I think that's a really interesting one as well.
Probably emphasize social media bots are widely used by governments in pursuit of geopolitical goals, which should give you an idea of just how potent they can be, that governments use them as part of information warfare techniques. Don't underestimate them. These are not tools used exclusively by sort of 14-year-olds in hoodies and sunglasses in their rooms, essentially. The people behind these are advanced professional actors.
Yeah, definitely. So I've got a question. At what point does it become worth investing in bot mitigation? How much are we accepting bots as the cost of doing business? Is there a tipping point?
I mean, it's always hard to say, obviously, as well, because it depends on the sort of solution you're planning to implement. And, if you're going to a third party, they may deal with enterprise-sized businesses and so forth. I would say that the time at which you need to look into this is probably the time at which it's become a concern for you. So let's say you're making bad decisions because you're getting skewed data or you're seeing ad fraud. That's probably the time you need to start looking into the problem. and costing up, okay, how much is this actually damage is this actually doing to us? And what's the actual cost of fixing it, to understand what your ROI is going to be. And I think there's got to be some degree of exploratory work there. But generally speaking, if you're probably on this webinar, it's probably at least a problem that you've got some degree of concern with. So it's probably the time to start exploring it now if you're on the webinar, if I'm honest.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you can always look for a solution. The solution that may be the most viable to you will likely depend on, well, it's like everything else. It's going to depend on what your budget is, what your traffic levels, and what you think your impact is. And I think if you look at the numbers from earlier and you run some calculations yourself, you'll very quickly have an idea of estimates of how much it's actually impacting your traffic, your decision making, wasted spend, and you can do that calculation quite easily. They're just quite easy ratios. I think Neil might even have a calculator on his website somewhere.
And that brings us on to the next slide. I think that's all the questions we've got for today. Obviously, if anyone thinks of anything else they'd like to ask, then they can send an email through. As you can see here. So yeah, I'd just like to say thanks again for everyone for joining today, and to everyone to MGM and Patrick from Spike. Thanks for joining us today, and of course Neil for PPC Protect. So if you're keen to find out about the bots that are on your website, obviously at Netacea we have a bot management solution, and you can get started with no integration required. So that's a really good path to take just to understand the intent of the traffic coming to your website. So you can visit our website or email hello@netacea.com if you're interested in that. Of course, as Patrick just mentioned as well, PPC Protect have lots of tools to help with this, with ad fraud specifically. So if you're concerned about ad fraud, then I'd reach out to PPC Protect. So I think that's about all we have time for today. So all that's left for me to say is thank you again for joining us. Thank you, MGM. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you to Neil. And thanks for joining me. And hope to see you again next time.
Thanks, Alex. Been a pleasure.
Thanks, Alex. Cheers.